Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here, and today's video we'll be doing a review and how to play video on Resident Evil 3 the board game, so let's get into it. Alright, so now that we have the game out, let's walk you through a bit more on how you play the game so you have a better idea on how it works, and then I'll jump into my review after that. So Resident Evil 3 the board game is really a survival horror based dungeon crawler where you play as different survivors trying to escape the zombie outbreak that is happening in Raccoon City. And so you'll play through various scenarios throughout a multi-part campaign trying to gather parts to the cable car so your group of survivors can escape Raccoon City. And so over multiple sessions, you'll play through a larger campaign and the game will expand the different cards and items that you find, which will allow you to unlock new areas and further progress throughout the campaign. And so the game is for 1 to 4 players, but the gameplay is very similar whether you're playing with multiple players or in a solo game. Now the scenario I have set up right now is Downtown 2, but when you first start out the campaign, you'll just have Commercial 1, Uptown 1, and Downtown 1 available. And so in some sense, it is kind of a choose your own adventure because you can start whichever one of those you want, and as you find new items, you'll be able to explore new scenarios within the campaign. And as you see, you might discover some areas of the campaign, but they remain locked until you find the key item to progress throughout the story. Now when you first set the game up, there'll be these C item tokens, and you want to arrange them in their specific piles. And so there's different types of these C items. There's one with a 1 check, there's some that have 2 checks, and then some that have 3 checks. And so what you want to do is arrange them all together, the 1 checks by themselves, the 2 checks by themselves, and the 3 checks by themselves. You'll shuffle each of the 3 piles separately, and then you'll put the 3 check mark cards on the bottom, the 2 on top of that, and then the 1 on top of that. Now they do come out in tier levels, as I said, the 1, 2, and 3, but they are at the same time randomized, so how the game unfolds can be completely different each time you play through a campaign. And so once you have those arranged, you'll simply put them on the C marker token on the campaign board. Another thing to note, at the start of your campaign, you'll have this threat meter or danger meter on the side, and you'll put the skull on the first starting spot with the S. But as I mentioned, I'm a few scenarios deep in the campaign right now, so that's why I have the danger counter at that point. You'll also have a variety of A-level items, and when you look at these, as you start out the campaign, you'll put all of them in except for those that have this little crossed out marker on the top right. You'll add these in later on in specific scenarios. So to start off, you'll build a pile that just simply has the items without that marker on it. Take your A items, shuffle them all up, and then put them on the side here in that designated spot. Now you also have a deck of tension cards, and when you play your first scenario, it will tell you which ones to include. It's a similar idea to the item cards where you won't include cards with this symbol in your first scenario, but as you progress through more scenarios, you'll steadily add more intense cards, which add a level of danger every time you draw through the tension deck. So again, shuffle that up based on the scenario you have, and you'll put that off to the side. There's also an event deck where you can shuffle those together and put them off to the side. And you can see in this spot, I do have cards right now. When you start the game, you won't have those, but these are simply items I currently have right now stored in my item box. And so as you play through the scenario, you'll have both an item box that can hold items, and you can also have items on your person in your inventory. On top of that, when you start the game, you'll choose a character that you want to play as. If you're playing in a solo mode, you'll choose 1 character. If you're playing with multiple characters, each player will control 1 character. You take your handgun ammo dial, and you'll set it to 15 ammo. And you'll also start with your starting item cards listed on your card. So in this case, Jill would start with the knife, the handgun, and the first aid spray. You'll set your health tracker to full in the fine category here. But as you can see, I have a few more items than that right now, just because I'm a couple scenarios into the campaign. So in this case, I've acquired a shotgun, so I'll need a shotgun ammo tracker in addition to the other cards that I carried over from a previous scenario. Now the next step that you want to do is you choose a scenario in the campaign that's currently unlocked for you, and then you'll build out the map tiles. And so it's pretty self-explanatory. All you need to do is match the shape to where the tiles go on the board, and that's mostly what you're concerned with. After that, you'll place the various items listed in the key here to build out the scenario, placing different items around the map, open and close doors, zombies waiting for you, and then you designate the different areas and potential danger zones as you enter them. Also, be sure to read the rest of the scenario, as it will let you know what additional cards to add to the B item deck, as well as any new cards you need to add to the tension deck before getting started, as well as any special rules that apply specifically to this scenario. But once you have the scenario set up, the campaign board set up, and all your items in place, you can begin the scenario. So I'll quickly run through the basic framework of a turn and what you can do, so you have a better idea on how you play throughout the game, but definitely consult the rulebook for more specifics if you have any questions. Alright, so when it comes to playing the game, each turn is going to consist of 3 different phases. So there's an action phase, a reaction phase, and then a tension phase. So during the action phase, you have multiple options of what you can do with your character. For example, you can move, you can open and close a door, you can search a tile that you're on, you can trade items with another player if you're in the same square as them, you can use an item from your inventory, or you can attack. And so during this action phase, your player can use up to 4 actions in any combination and order that you choose. You don't have to use all 4, so if you wanted to hold off exploring a room, for example, you could do that. So again, it's pretty simple. Each movement is just 1 square with your character. If I wanted to open a door, I would just simply flip it over from the closed side to the open side. Another thing to note is that when you're moving around the board, if you move into an area that has one of these slash symbols, you're going to need to roll an encounter die and potentially spawn enemies in that area. So again, this doesn't happen until you step on a square in that room for the first time. So let's say I did that. I would then roll this black encounter die, and depending on what I rolled, it would activate enemies in that area. So typically the higher numbers like 6 are good to roll and less danger will happen, and the lower numbers like a 1 is kind of the worst case scenario. Now if you look at the scenario that you're playing, it will show you the consequence of what happens when you roll an encounter die in the color that you're in. So in this case, we're in the yellow one. Let's say I rolled a 5, I would spawn 1 zombie on one of the biohazard symbols on that tile. Let's say I was on the amber tile here and I rolled a number. Again, I would choose from the corresponding result in this little table here. Orange is usually more intense and more difficult than the yellow section, so pay attention to that. Now, like I mentioned, another thing that you can do on your turn is attack. And so if you have weapons in your inventory and you have enough corresponding ammo to use them, you can activate one of your weapons for an attack. And so when we look at the card, it tells you what type of weapon they are. It shows you what type of ammo they use, and this indicates the maximum amount of ammo the item can have. This first box here tells you the range of the weapon. So with the knife, for example, it's 1, and the gun has the range of line of sight. And so how line of sight works, if you can draw a straight line from the middle of your square to the middle of another square, and it doesn't go through any red lines like a wall or any obstacles you can't see through, that would be within line of sight. The second symbol is how many die you'll roll and of what type. So in this case, both of these items, you would use 1 blue die. You would then roll that die, and then depending on what symbols show up, you might activate additional abilities on the weapon. So in this case, if I rolled this symbol, I could push an enemy, moving them 1 square further away. If I got the shot symbol here, I would do the amount of damage shown in this spot. Another item to pay attention to, like you can see on the handgun here, is this bottom symbol, and that means rapid fire. And so that means I can roll up to 2 more die by expending an additional ammo per die I want to use. So normally on the handgun, for example, if I wanted to use it once, I would simply use 1 ammo. But if I wanted to use this rapid fire, I could go from 15 to 12, for example, expend 3 bullets, and then roll 3 die and calculate the results from there. And so like most Resident Evil video games, ammo is very limited throughout the scenarios, so you really want to make sure that you use it only when you really need to get yourself out of a scenario. Now, one thing to note is that if you do attack during your turn, the enemies will make an out of sequence reaction. And so this is before the reaction phase. And so how that works is that any enemies that are on the same tile or a linked tile to you will perform this reaction. And so what a linked tile means is that when you look on the board, you have the shape of the tile you're in. If there's any open doors that are attached to that tile, that would be considered a linked tile. And so if you're not directly within range of an enemy, all the enemies would simply take their move action at that time. And so in this case, the zombies would move 1, as that's the only zombies that are linked in the current tile. If a zombie happened to be in your space and could attack you, it would attack, and then you would need to activate an evade roll. And so how that works, you simply look at your character card, and this symbol right here indicates how many die you would roll on an evade roll. And so as Jill, I would roll 2 die to evade, and then I would look at how many enemies are in my specific square or in range that it could attack me. And so you can see this little chart here. It shows you'll be successful at evading depending on the monsters that are in your attack range. So if you had a small base monster like a zombie, you could roll any of those 3 dice and be successful. If you had a medium base monster or 2 small bases, you'd need to roll that. Or if you had a medium base and a small base or 3 small bases, you would need to roll that 3rd symbol to be successful at evading. Another thing to note is if you failed the evade and were hit and the enemy is in the same square as you, you can actually push them to an adjacent square. Now after you've made all the moves you want to during your action phase, it moves to the reaction phase, and this is when enemies will activate. And so again, it turns to the enemies that are linked to your tile. They're either going to perform a move action if they're not in attack range, or attack if they are in attack range. And so you can simply look at the monster card and we'll tell you some key things, like the range the zombie will move in this case, the health the zombie has, the threat level of the zombie, and what happens if they were successful in attacking. In this case, they have a range of 0, so they can only attack character pieces that are on the same square as them, and if they're successful, they'll deal 1 damage. And so each enemy has their own unique stats, health, and abilities, and some of them will even have multiple sets of abilities, depending on what tension card was most recently played. Now, all enemies don't necessarily attack at once. What happens is that out of all the enemies within range of your character, the one that has the highest threat level will attack your character. And then if again you're to be successful in evading that attack, it would be based on the chart I showed earlier, whether it's a small base, a medium base, or 2 small bases, or some combination of that. Another thing to note is if you're trying to take any type of action when an enemy is in the same space as you that is not an attack, you need to first perform an evade roll to first see if you're successful dodging an enemy attack before performing that action. So let's say, for example, I wanted to use my green herb because my character was injured. I would first need to perform an evade roll in this case to see if I can dodge the enemy attack, and then if I'm successful, I would be able to use that green herb as the action. But again, if I fail, I would receive the damage that that enemy does to my character, and then since they're on the same square, I could push them 1 away. Now, most scenarios will have a key objective that you need to complete in order to clear the scenario, but throughout the scenario, also find many items scattered throughout the map. So if you were to land on an A space, for example, and then had an action left to search, you would draw an A card from the A deck. Now there's different types of items. There's A items, there's B items, and there's also C items. Now A items are usually helpful items that can help keep your character alive, such as ammo and green herb. Now B items are specific to the scenario and will often include items that you need to progress through different parts of the scenario. So it might be a special key to unlock a door. C items are optional to collect, but they will be used to unlock new areas throughout the campaign. So unless you're not going to survive, it's usually suggested to collect those C items, as they can lead to new scenarios which will progress the campaign. And if the danger level reaches the top of the meter before you've completed the overall campaign, you'll lose. So it's generally best to not be forced to replay scenarios. You can if you want to though, if there's maybe an item left behind or you want to collect more ammo, whatever the case might be, that's always an option. Another thing to be on the lookout for are these campaign progression tokens, and so you'll need to look in the specific scenario guide, but when you find one of these on the map, you'll be able to unlock a new portion of the campaign. So in this case, if I get to that point in this scenario, I'll be able to pick up that locked downtown card, place it on the downtown 3 undiscovered spot, and then once I have that battery card in this case, I'd be able to unlock that scenario later on in the campaign. Now I mentioned it earlier, you'll also find these item boxes, and this allows you access to deposit items from your inventory or to retrieve items you've previously stored in the item box. There's also typewriters throughout the scenario, and if your character has an ink ribbon on hand, you'll be able to use that in that location to reshuffle the tension deck. And so the tension deck comes into play for phase 3 of your turn. And so after you've taken your action phase, enemies have taken their reaction phase, it's now time for the tension phase. And how that works is you simply draw the top card on the tension deck. So at this point, you'll read what the card says and will activate some type of event happening throughout the board. And so there's different levels of intensity. There's the green cards, there's the orange cards, and then the red cards, each getting progressively worse for your character. So in this case, I would just simply follow through on this card, discard it, and then move on to the next turn. Now, if your character ever receives damage past the danger line, they would die and you would fail the scenario. You also fail the scenario if the tension deck becomes completely empty and you can no longer draw from it. But pay attention to the scenario that you're on, because some of the earlier scenarios that's not the case and they let you reshuffle it once it's empty. But in later scenarios, if you can't draw anymore, you usually lose the scenario. There's also event tokens that you'll find on the stage, and when you land on that, you'll draw an event card or refer back to the scenario synopsis where they might tell you what happens when you reach that point. So if you draw an event card, it happens there, or again, you might need to consult the scenario rules for some special event that might happen specific to that scenario. Now, I won't break down all the rules here, but check out this page here to find out what happens when you either successfully complete a scenario or if you fail a scenario. There's several steps that will set you up for the next scenario you choose to play through, so follow those steps here. But again, as I mentioned, this isn't every single rule in the game, so definitely consult the rulebook if you have questions, or feel free to leave us a comment, and I can try and answer those questions when I can. But now that you have a better idea on how the game works, let's jump into my review. Now, right off the bat, I'm a huge fan of the Resident Evil series. It's one of my favorite video game series of all time. I love survival horror video games, and seeing that video game series translated into a board game got me really excited. So as I mentioned in the how to play section, this game is a survival horror dungeon crawler where you're going to play as different survivors in Raccoon City trying to escape the zombie outbreak. And the way you'll do that is by completing different scenarios throughout a larger campaign, collecting items that you'll be able to use to repair the cable car and escape Raccoon City. And so right off the bat, the game definitely falls right in line with the overall theme of the Resident Evil series. Even though it is a dungeon crawler, it's a lot more about survival than simply killing everything that you see. In fact, that's probably going to be hard to do because in most cases you're going to miss with your weapons and have very limited ammo to take out every zombie you'll encounter throughout each scenario. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of it where you really had to strategize and plan out your moves and how you wanted to complete the scenario. Where again, it's not like you had unlimited ammo or it was easy to hit everything. Oftentimes you'll be running out of ammo or making tough choices if you want to try and run past an enemy and evade their attacks, or use a last-ditch effort of using your knife to take out zombies. And a lot of times you'll barely make it through a scenario or even fail and have to try the scenario again. But even with that in mind, it's not a complete detriment if you fail a scenario, because a lot of times in that scenario you'll be faced with the choice on fighting off Nemesis or fleeing, and depending on what you choose could impact how much the overall danger level increases throughout the campaign. And a lot of times if you're successful at defeating Nemesis, danger level will go back down, and so if you fail the first time you might be able to make up for it by taking out Nemesis in a later replay of a scenario. The game has a ton of content in it as well. There's well over 10 scenarios in the campaign, and on top of that, each time you play through the campaign, some aspects are randomized, so it can create a totally new experience every time you play through the entire campaign. The game is great as a multiplayer game, but it also plays incredibly well as a solo board game and really gives you that feel like you're playing a Resident Evil video game. I also really enjoyed the overall campaign aspect because as you explore different scenarios, it's not like you go from one scenario right to the next one to the next one. You're given multiple options to choose from at the start, and then depending on what items you find throughout the scenarios, which is a little bit randomized, can lead you into unlocking new scenarios in the campaign based on the items that you found. So I really like that. It gives you choices and really makes it feel like you're choosing your own adventure when you play the game. You also never feel overpowered as your character. In fact, it's almost quite the opposite, where you always feel like you need to be on edge, using your healing items to make it through scenarios, and barely surviving encounters with intense boss fights. The game can seem quite complex when you first dive into it, but once you understand the overall flow of the turn, it becomes pretty quick to play through and understand what you're doing. Overall, if you like the Resident Evil series, if you like dungeon crawling board games with a survival horror twist to them, I highly recommend checking out this game. I've had a blast with it. I think it holds up if you're not a Resident Evil fan, but if you are a Resident Evil fan, you'll enjoy it even more. But let me know in the comments below, have you played this game before? Have you played any other Resident Evil board games or other survival horror dungeon crawling games? Let me know in the comments below what other ones I should check out. or if you enjoyed this one. If you want to pick up a copy of this game, there'll be a link in the description below where you can do so. And if you like this video, be sure to smash that like button as it really helps out the channel. And if you like videos like this on video games, board games, and everything nerdy, check out one of our other videos here. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.